Eastern Kentucky, spring 1981. Sunday arrived quietly, without ceremony, the hills unchanged and the roads bending where they always had. Mount Hope Baptist stood at the edge of town, plain and unremarkable, a place meant to be used rather than questioned. Cars pulled in slowly, leaving careful distance between them, families stepping out already separated by history before they crossed the threshold. Church in this county was never about belief, it was about order. Earl Hale arrived early, as expected, taking a seat near the front with the calm of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Thomas Hale stayed standing near the side wall, eyes tracking arrivals, noting absences. William Mercer entered with his family, offering Earl a brief nod that carried no warmth, only recognition. Frank Mercer followed, stiff and silent, while Ellen kept her head lowered, aware that attention had consequences. Robert Mercer shifted in his seat, uneasy without knowing why. Reverend Paul Knox began the service on time, his voice steady and familiar, words passing over the room without settling. The sermon mattered less than the timing. No one arrived late. When the last car door closed outside, the sound drifted in, followed by the heavier, deliberate closing of the church's main doors. It was not loud, but it was final. A few heads turned. No one spoke. Silence here was never empty. The sermon shortened as if trimmed by instinct. At the closing prayer, Knox paused, just long enough to make the moment register. The doors stayed shut. No one stood to leave. By then, everyone inside Mount Hope Baptist understood the same thing. This Sunday had been decided long before they arrived. The pause after the closing prayer stretched longer than custom allowed, long enough for discomfort to turn into awareness. Reverend Knox remained at the pulpit, hands resting flat, eyes lowered, as if waiting for permission that would never come. Earl Hale stayed seated, calm intact, while Thomas shifted slightly toward the side aisle, positioning himself without urgency. William Mercer glanced once toward the doors and then away, already understanding that the sound they had made earlier was not accidental. Frank Mercer started to rise and stopped himself halfway, restraint tightening his posture more than movement ever could. Ellen Mercer felt the change before she could name it, the room settling into a shape that excluded exit. Robert looked from face to face, searching for a signal that never arrived. Knox finally spoke, not scripture but a single sentence delivered evenly, stating there would be a brief delay before dismissal. No reason was given. None was required. Outside, no engine started. Inside, the air grew heavier as seconds passed without resolution. Someone near the back shifted their feet, the scrape loud enough to draw attention and then disappear into silence. Thomas moved again, subtle, deliberate, close enough to be noticed without appearing confrontational. Earl and William shared a glance that carried no surprise, only confirmation that what had been discussed privately was now in effect. When a voice finally broke the stillness, it came from someone who believed Sunday rules still applied, and it lasted only a moment before being swallowed by the room. That sound marked the end of uncertainty. From then on, everyone inside Mount Hope Baptist understood the same thing. The doors were not closed to keep anything out. They were closed to keep everything in. Once that understanding settled, the room stopped behaving like a congregation and began behaving like a ledger being balanced. Reverend Knox stepped fully away from the pulpit, not in retreat but in acknowledgement that the authority in the room had shifted. Earl Hale rose to his feet without haste, the movement calm enough to steady others who were watching him for cues they pretended not to need. Thomas Hale took another step into the aisle, close enough now that his presence registered as intention rather than coincidence. Across from them, William Mercer remained seated, hands folded, eyes fixed forward, as if standing would concede something he was not prepared to give. Frank Mercer finally straightened, his restraint thinning, while Ellen felt the space around her narrow as people adjusted positions that were no longer casual. Robert tried to speak and stopped, the sound catching in his throat when a firm hand pressed him back into the pew. Not violently, just enough to remove choice. Near the rear, someone tested the doors again, harder this time, and the dull resistance answered clearly. No one shouted. No one rushed. Panic required uncertainty, and there was none left. Earl spoke then, his voice low, steady, carrying easily through the room, stating that certain matters had been allowed to linger too long, that agreements had been broken quietly and would now be addressed the same way. He did not name names because names would have narrowed responsibility. This was larger than that. William Mercer finally turned his head, meeting Earl's gaze, understanding that silence was now participation whether he accepted it or not. Around them, the room tightened further, people becoming obstacles, witnesses becoming liabilities, and the church, built to gather, revealing how easily it could also contain. The first act of violence did not announce itself with a gunshot, it began with proximity, with the simple decision to stand too close to someone who had been an enemy for years without consequence. Frank Mercer moved before William could stop him, his shoulder brushing past Thomas Hale in a way that could not be mistaken for accident. The contact was brief, but it collapsed the last remaining distance between intention and action. A hand came up, another answered it, and the sound of flesh striking flesh echoed sharply through the wooden interior, louder than any prayer spoken there that morning. Someone shouted a name, not as a warning but as an accusation, and the room reacted as if released from restraint. Earl Hale did not step back, he stepped aside, allowing momentum to move forward without placing himself at its center. Knox watched from near the pulpit, face pale, understanding that intervention now would only choose a side he had already chosen by remaining silent. Robert Mercer struggled again, fear finally overtaking confusion. But the grip on him tightened, not cruelly, just enough to keep him seated while events unfolded inches away. A bench tipped, then another, the scrape of wood against floor breaking whatever order still pretended to exist. When the first weapon appeared, small and easily concealed, its presence shifted the tone instantly, drawing breath from the room. It was not raised immediately. It did not need to be. Its visibility alone clarified what words no longer could. Earl spoke once more, quieter than before, stating that no one would leave until accounts were settled, that rushing would only make things worse. William Mercer understood the lie inside that sentence and remained still, knowing movement would be interpreted as defiance. Around them, men who had shared meals and favors positioned themselves according to loyalties that had been dormant but never erased. The church absorbed it all, every step, every breath becoming less a. What followed unfolded unevenly, not as a single surge but as a series of small decisions that fed into one another. Someone fell against a pew and stayed there longer than expected, the delay enough to draw attention without drawing help. Thomas Hale moved quickly then, not striking, not shouting, but inserting himself where motion threatened to become disorder, redirecting bodies with firm hands and short commands that carried weight because they were not loud. Earl remained just outside the center, watching outcomes rather than causes, while William Mercer finally stood, his movements slow and deliberate, a calculated risk meant to signal control rather than challenge. Frank's breathing grew heavier, anger breaking through restraint, and when he lunged again the response was immediate, two men intercepting him before he reached his target, their intervention efficient and practiced. Reverend Knox backed further toward the wall, eyes fixed on the floor, aware that witnessing was becoming its own form of involvement. Near the back, the doors rattled once more, then stopped, the person testing them realizing resistance would only draw notice. Robert's fear sharpened into clarity as he recognized that what was happening was not spontaneous, that the room was being shaped intentionally, pressure applied where it would hold. A sharp crack cut through the noise, not from a firearm but from wood splintering, a pew giving way under weight, and the sound carried authority, freezing movement for a brief moment. Earl used that pause, speaking again, stating calmly that escalation would be met with consequence, that this gathering had a purpose beyond chaos. The lie was thinner now but still useful. Around him, the congregation had ceased to exist, replaced by sides, positions, and the growing certainty that by the time the doors opened again, the balance of this county would be permanently altered. The moment of stillness did not last, but it changed the rhythm, turning raw motion into something measured and intentional. Earl Hale watched as men repositioned themselves without instruction, some stepping back, others forward, each choice quietly narrowing the paths available to those who had not been included in the planning. William Mercer spoke then, his voice controlled, not raised, addressing Earl directly as if the room did not exist, accusing him of forcing a reckoning that could have remained buried. Earl answered without heat, stating that buried things eventually surfaced whether anyone wanted them to or not, that waiting had only made the cost higher. Thomas moved again, blocking a line of sight between two men whose history did not need explanation, his presence enough to cool an impulse before it found form. Frank Mercer broke free of the hands holding him, not to attack but to speak, words spilling out sharp and disordered, naming past favors, broken promises, land exchanged under false terms. The names landed unevenly, some drawing recognition, others deliberate avoidance. Knox pressed himself closer to the wall, realizing that every word spoken was reshaping what would later be denied. Near the back, a woman began to cry softly, the sound thin and persistent, a reminder that not everyone in the room had been accounted for. Earl acknowledged it with a glance, then continued, stating that no one present was innocent of knowing more than they admitted, that silence had been a currency spent freely for years. The accusation hung heavy, settling over both families equally, eroded only by the growing awareness that some debts were about to be collected immediately. The crying stopped as abruptly as it had begun, not from comfort but from recognition that vulnerability no longer served a purpose here. Earl Hale shifted his stance slightly, signaling without words that the moment for speaking was closing. Thomas responded first, moving with intention toward the center aisle, his presence drawing attention away from the back where uncertainty still lingered. William Mercer felt the room constrict, the options narrowing to stillness or provocation, and chose stillness, knowing movement now would be interpreted as confession. Frank's anger curdled into something colder as he realized the names he had spoken had not disrupted the order but confirmed it. Ellen watched faces harden around her. Men she had known since childhood now defined less by memory than by position. A sharp command cut through the murmurs, brief and absolute, and two men separated a growing cluster before it could collapse into chaos. Knox closed his eyes, aware that the shape of what would be remembered was already being decided, not by facts but by who remained able to speak afterward. Near the front, someone dropped to their knees, not in prayer but in instinct, and the sight triggered movement that could not be called mercy. Earl raised his hand once, halting it, stating calmly that there was a sequence to these things, that disorder would only complicate what needed to be finished. The authority in his voice was not moral, it was logistical. The room adjusted again, every person recalculating distance, allegiance, and survival, understanding that the worst moments were not the ones already past, but the ones that had been planned to come next. The sequence Earl referred to began without ceremony. A quiet signal passed between men who did not look at each other when it happened. Thomas stepped aside at the same moment two others moved forward, their timing practiced enough to feel rehearsed rather than reactive. William Mercer noticed the shift and understood too late that standing had placed him exactly where he was expected to be, visible to everyone, isolated without being touched. Frank tried to speak again and was cut off, not by a blow but by pressure at his chest that forced the air from him and left him bent forward, stunned more than hurt. Ellen's eyes searched for Knox, some residual belief that his presence still meant something, but the Reverend remained motionless, a figure reduced to witness by his own restraint. Near the side wall, a man produced a small firearm, keeping it low, not raised, its purpose clear without demonstration. The sight of it recalibrated the room instantly, conversations dying mid-breath, movement slowing to increments that could be controlled. Earl spoke again, stating that what followed was not punishment but correction, that imbalance had consequences regardless of intent. The phrasing mattered, because it allowed those listening to imagine themselves as observers rather than participants. Someone near the aisle stumbled, caught, then held upright, denied even the release of falling. The church seemed smaller now, the ceiling lower, the exits theoretical. In that compressed space, choices evaporated, replaced by compliance and calculation, each person understanding that survival no longer depended on innocence, but on whether their presence still served a purpose to those directing the room. Once the firearm entered the equation, The room settled into a different kind of order, one built on restraint rather than hope. No shots were fired, none needed to be, because the threat alone accomplished what shouting never could. William Mercer felt the attention shift fully onto him, not as a target but as a reference point, the man through whom decisions would now be justified. Earl Hale addressed him directly, stating that arrangements made years earlier had been revisited without consent, that land meant to remain dormant had been quietly offered up, not for survival but for leverage. William did not deny it. Denial would have suggested fear. Instead he argued necessity, claiming pressures beyond the county, forces that demanded cooperation. The explanation fell flat, not because it was untrue, but because everyone present understood that necessity was the excuse men used when they wanted to appear cornered rather than ambitious. Thomas watched the exchange closely, noting who listened and who looked away. Frank regained his breath and laughed once, sharply, the sound cutting through the tension before stopping when no one joined him. Ellen realized then that whatever outcome followed would be framed as inevitable, regardless of how many people it required. Near the back, someone shifted again and froze when the firearm tilted slightly in response, a reminder that even small movements were being recorded. Earl concluded the exchange calmly, stating that certain corrections could not be postponed any longer, that the church had been chosen precisely because no one could claim surprise at what happened there. The statement landed heavily, transforming the building from a passive container into an accomplice, and with that, the final barrier between restraint and consequence began to erode. The erosion did not happen all at once. It came in controlled increments, each one justified as prevention rather than escalation. Earl Hale nodded once and the men closest to William Mercer adjusted their positions, not touching him yet, simply removing the illusion of space. William spoke again, slower now, offering names, suggesting compromises, attempting to widen the field so responsibility would diffuse. The strategy failed because diffusion was no longer useful. Thomas Hale stepped forward and stated plainly that names offered too late only confirmed intent, that timing mattered more than truth. Frank Mercer reacted to that, his voice rising, accusing the Hales of engineering this outcome long before any land changed hands, and for a moment the accusation hung in the air unanswered. Earl did not deny it. He responded by saying that preparation was not the same as provocation, that readiness only became visible when someone forced its use. The distinction was thin, but it held. Near the front, a man was pushed down onto a pew and held there, not struck, just immobilized, his resistance brief and ineffective. Knox turned his face away, understanding that every second he remained was another second he would later explain poorly. The firearm shifted again, not raised, only re-aimed, and that small adjustment redirected the entire room's attention. Earl announced that the first account would be settled now, not because it was the largest, but because delay had already cost too much. No one asked what that meant. They understood that from this point forward, events would no longer be framed as discussions, but as outcomes. The first outcome unfolded with procedural calm, stripped of spectacle and urgency, as if urgency might introduce error. William Mercer was guided forward, not dragged, hands briefly restrained more for symbolism than necessity. His compliance noted and used against him. Earl Hale spoke while it happened, outlining facts rather than accusations, describing timelines, signatures, meetings that had taken place away from this county, all delivered in a tone that suggested documentation rather than judgment. William listened, realizing too late that the purpose was not persuasion but alignment, ensuring everyone present heard the same version before memory could fracture it. Frank surged again and was stopped immediately, not by force but by numbers, the collective decision of men who understood momentum better than anger. Ellen closed her eyes, absorbing the shape of what would later be denied, knowing survival now depended on forgetting selectively. The firearm remained visible, unchanged, its role complete without discharge. When William finally spoke, his voice was steady, conceding nothing, but that steadiness only reinforced the conclusion that he had anticipated this confrontation and miscalculated its venue. Earl signaled again, a small motion, and William was moved aside, not removed from the room but repositioned where he could observe rather than influence. The message was unmistakable. This was not an execution of bodies but of standing. By the time William was released, the balance had shifted, and those watching understood that what was being dismantled was not a family, but an authority that had overreached and could no longer be allowed to persist. Acknowledgement came not as words but as compliance, Frank Mercer allowing himself to be guided forward with a stiffness that signaled resistance redirected inward. The men flanking him moved with restraint, careful not to escalate, because escalation would have shifted the narrative from correction to chaos. Earl Hale spoke again, briefly, stating that what followed was not about settling anger but preventing repetition, that examples were necessary when memory proved unreliable. Thomas positioned himself between Frank and the rest of the room, not as a shield but as a divider, narrowing the audience to only those who needed to see. William Mercer watched from where he had been placed, recognizing the design too late, understanding that distance did not equal safety, only postponement. The firearm remained low, unchanged, a constant that made alternatives unnecessary. Frank tried once more to speak and stopped when no one reacted, the absence of response stripping the words of value before they formed. Ellen felt the room harden, a collective acceptance replacing uncertainty, and realized that survival here depended on stillness more than agreement. Earl concluded the sequence with a single instruction, delivered quietly, and the men around Frank acted immediately, efficient and contained. There was movement, controlled pressure, a brief struggle that did not become a spectacle, and then a sudden, heavy quiet that followed when resistance ended. No one cheered. No one looked relieved. The point had not been release but demonstration, and as the room absorbed the outcome, it became clear that the church was no longer holding a gathering, but a lesson being learned in real time. The quiet that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, not shocked silence but the kind that settles when outcomes can no longer be revised. Frank Mercer was moved aside and left where he stood, no longer the center of attention, his presence reduced to consequence rather than catalyst. Earl Hale did not linger on it, turning instead to the room, reminding everyone that visibility mattered, that what had just occurred was meant to be seen clearly and remembered selectively. Thomas repositioned again, subtly reopening space while still controlling flow, allowing breath back into the room without restoring comfort. William Mercer lowered his eyes for the first time, recognizing that authority had shifted not through force alone but through consensus manufactured in real time. Ellen watched faces around her change, fear giving way to calculation, people reassessing what they would later claim to have witnessed. Reverend Knox remained still, understanding that survival now depended on silence more than faith. Near the doors, the tension eased just enough for movement to resume in small increments, people sitting, standing, adjusting as if normalcy might be reassembled piece by piece. Earl spoke once more, stating that this was not the end, only the correction of a trajectory that had veered too far. He made it clear that leaving would happen in order, that disorder outside would undo what had been achieved inside. The message landed cleanly. By the time the locks were tested again, not forced but prepared for release, everyone inside Mount Hope Baptist understood that what had been decided there would travel far beyond those walls, reshaping the county without ever being fully explained. Release did not come immediately because immediacy would have suggested panic, and panic was something Earl Hale refused to allow this moment. He waited, letting the room sit with what had occurred, giving people time to internalize their new positions before motion resumed. When he finally nodded, the doors were unlocked slowly, the sound deliberate, almost ceremonial, the reversal of the noise that had sealed them earlier. No one rushed. Leaving too quickly would mark a person as frightened, and fear invited questions later. Thomas directed movement with brief gestures, allowing small groups to pass rather than a surge, ensuring faces were seen and remembered in the correct order. William Mercer stepped forward when indicated, not looking back, understanding that dignity now lay in compliance rather than resistance. Ellen followed at a distance, already rehearsing the version of the morning she would share and the details she would omit. Outside, sunlight felt intrusive, unchanged by what had taken place inside, and that contrast unsettled those who crossed the threshold. Cars started one by one, engines idling longer than necessary as drivers waited for permission that would never be given explicitly. Reverend Knox exited last, locking the doors behind him with hands that trembled just enough to be noticed by those watching. By the time the church stood empty again, the building appeared unchanged, but everyone who left understood that something irreversible had been completed, and that the consequences would not arrive all at once, but would surface gradually, in rumors, absences, and decisions made quietly in the weeks to come. The days that followed did not erupt into investigation or outrage. They thinned instead, people moving through town with a new economy of words, conversations shortening where they once lingered. Frank Mercer did not return home that evening, and by morning his absence had already begun to settle into something that felt rehearsed. William Mercer remained visible, attending to routine with exaggerated normalcy, understanding that presence was now his only remaining leverage. Earl Hale did not appear in public for several days, not out of caution but strategy, allowing others to carry the weight of explanation while he remained undefined. Thomas handled what needed handling, checking on men whose loyalty had been tested, reminding some gently and others less so that silence was not optional. Ellen Mercer fielded questions with practiced vagueness, offering concern without detail, shaping uncertainty into something unprovable. Sheriff Don Elridge arrived late, as expected, his inquiries broad and unfocused, designed to confirm that nothing could be confirmed. He spoke to Knox briefly, long enough to establish mutual understanding, short enough to avoid implication. The church reopened the following Sunday, the doors unlocked, the pews repaired, the space restored to function without acknowledging interruption. Attendance dropped, then stabilized, those who returned careful about where they sat and who they greeted. The massacre, as it would later be called by outsiders, never entered official record as such. Inside the county, it became something else entirely, a boundary set, a warning understood, and as weeks passed without consequence, the lesson embedded itself quietly, altering behavior without ever requiring repetition. By summer, the event had been folded into the county's routines, referenced obliquely if at all, its specifics blurred by repetition and omission. Frank Mercer's name stopped appearing in conversation, replaced by vague phrases that suggested departure rather than removal. William adjusted quickly, relinquishing certain interests without protest, redirecting others through intermediaries who understood the new limits. Earl Hale reemerged gradually, his presence unremarkable, authority now assumed rather than asserted. Thomas ensured continuity, overseeing transactions that corrected earlier deviations, making it clear that cooperation would be remembered and hesitation would not. Ellen kept her distance from town centers, her silence interpreted as grief rather than calculation, a distinction she did nothing to challenge. Sheriff Elridge closed what little inquiry had been opened, citing lack of clarity, lack of witnesses, lack of reason to pursue further. Knox resumed his role fully, sermons returning to familiar themes, his pauses shorter now, his eyes avoiding certain sections of the room. Outsiders noticed changes without understanding them. Deals rerouted, land reassessed, alliances quietly redefined. The church stood unchanged, but its role had shifted, no longer a neutral ground but a reference point, a place that required no explanation to those who had been there. As the season turned, the county settled into a new equilibrium, one shaped less by fear than by precision, the understanding that boundaries had been demonstrated once and would not need to be demonstrated again. Autumn brought distance, both physical and psychological, as people adjusted routes through town, choosing when to be seen and when to remain absent. Properties connected to the Mercer name changed hands quietly, transactions completed without negotiation, prices accepted without argument. William Mercer attended fewer public gatherings, not excluded but irrelevant, a man whose presence no longer altered outcomes. Earl Hale did not need to enforce anything himself, the structure held without visible pressure, compliance now self-sustaining. Thomas monitored from a distance, intervening only when patterns threatened to drift, a reminder delivered privately rather than publicly. Ellen relocated temporarily, the move framed as necessity, her departure removing a lingering variable. Sheriff Elridge maintained the appearance of oversight, checking boxes that required no answers, satisfied that stability had been restored on terms he did not need to document. Knox continued services uninterrupted, the church functioning as it always had, though those who attended carried themselves differently, aware that the building had already served its other purpose. Stories filtered out of the county and returned altered, stripped of sequence and intent, transformed into speculation that could not survive scrutiny. What remained intact was not the truth but the outcome, a recalibrated order that required no further explanation to those living inside it. Winter closed in early, the cold flattening movement and sealing habits into place, and with it came the final confirmations that what had been done would remain done. The land beneath Mount Hope Baptist was surveyed and dismissed publicly, its value declared negligible, the paperwork clean enough to discourage curiosity. William Mercer signed where indicated and did not ask why certain clauses had been added, understanding that questions now functioned as confessions. Earl Hale attended one town meeting before leaving early, his presence enough to settle disputes without comment. Thomas redirected a shipment that would once have caused argument, the change accepted without protest. Ellen sent word that she would not be returning soon, her absence converting memory into rumor. Sheriff Elridge filed his last note and closed the folder, satisfied that disorder had been contained and would not reflect back on him. Knox preached on patience and restraint, his words landing without irony, the congregation attentive but altered. The church bell rang on schedule, its sound unchanged, though those who heard it now understood it marked time differently. By the end of the year, the massacre had become a private reference, invoked only through silence and timing, and the county moved forward with an efficiency that suggested not healing, but resolution. Years later, when outsiders attempted to reconstruct what had happened that Sunday, they found only clean surfaces and cooperative answers. Records showed nothing irregular, timelines aligned just well enough to discourage further inquiry, and those who had been present spoke with a consistency that felt practiced rather than rehearsed. William Mercer aged quickly, his influence fading without a visible struggle, his name retained only for formality. Earl Hale's authority persisted beyond his appearances, decisions attributed to process rather than person. Thomas eventually stepped back, his role complete, the system stable enough to function without him in the open. Ellen's absence hardened into permanence, her silence doing more work than testimony ever could. Sheriff Elridge retired with a reputation for keeping order, his tenure summarized without footnotes. Reverend Knox remained, delivering sermons that avoided reflection, his voice steady, his pauses brief. The church itself required no protection, because protection was no longer necessary. The lesson it had contained traveled quietly through the county, guiding behavior without reference. What endured was not fear but efficiency, an understanding that some corrections occurred once and did not require repetition, and that remembering too clearly offered no advantage to anyone still living there. By the time a decade had passed, the morning in 1981 existed only as an outline, its details worn smooth by deliberate neglect. New families moved through the county without learning where not to stand or which names shorten conversations, guided instead by patterns that felt natural because they had been enforced long before. The land changed hands again under different pretexts, each transfer cleaner than the last, distance adding legitimacy where proximity once raised questions. William Mercer's death was noted briefly, framed as the quiet end of a reduced life, his absence closing the last door to revision. Earl Hale's name surfaced less often, not because it had lost meaning, but because meaning no longer required attribution. Thomas appeared occasionally, never staying long, his presence a reminder rather than a directive. Knox aged in place, sermons softening without ever addressing the past, the church remaining functional, neutral in appearance, complicit by omission. Sheriff Elridge's replacement inherited order without context, enforcing boundaries whose origins were unnecessary to understand. What remained was a county that functioned with fewer disputes and quicker conclusions, decisions made efficiently, dissent rerouted before it formed. The massacre, when mentioned at all, surfaced as a vague anomaly, a story without a center, stripped of sequence and responsibility. That absence was the final outcome, not forgetting, but control over what forgetting looked like, ensuring the event achieved what it had been designed to accomplish long after the doors were unlocked. Mount Hope Baptist still stood at the edge of town, unchanged enough to avoid attention, repaired whenever needed and ignored whenever possible. People entered and left it without pausing, unaware of how carefully the building had once been used. No marker recorded what happened there in 1981, no document carried the full sequence, and no one remaining had reason to assemble it again. The locked doors were remembered only as a sound, never explained, a detail that survived because it required no context. What endured was the structure built afterward, a county shaped by an event that no longer needed to be named to function. Decisions continued to resolve themselves quietly, disputes ended before becoming visible, and authority moved without introducing itself. Those who had been present aged, disappeared, or learned when silence was more valuable than memory. The massacre was never corrected, challenged, or avenged, because it had never been framed as a crime within the boundaries that mattered. It existed instead as a calibration, a moment when control had been demonstrated efficiently and then withdrawn. By the time the church bell rang on another ordinary Sunday, its sound carried no warning, no echo of what it had once contained, only the confirmation that the system it sealed into place was still holding, long after the doors had been unlocked and the morning itself had been allowed to fade.